Seth, your book, Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time, was a fascinating read. You went around the country to find how communities and neighborhoods were overcoming certain challenges, any challenge from inequality to racism to crime to poverty to broken families to addiction, and really anything in between. So when I was reading your book, one thing that really came to mind, which I found interesting, and I wanted to lead the conversation with this is, you see people from all over the world wanting to come to the United States. They're trying to seek a better life. Our border seems pretty open right now, but when you look at it, we actually have division in politics. We have division in races. We have division in class. There's a lot of division, and it's hard for people to really understand who they can be believing right now. So it feels like there's a lot of broken pieces. So my question to you is, how fragile is America really? And in your opinion, what's the most troubling part?
So I for a living work on fragile states, fragile societies. So first of all, when I talk about America, I often have foreign eyes. I've worked on 35 countries. And when you describe people wanting to come to America, I see it all over the world. I've been in 75 or so countries. And so that's a genuine sentiment. On the other hand, I would say people, when they arrive and even where they are, at times they are shocked by some of the types of problems we have. And I think you have to understand America is materially an extremely wealthy country. There's only a few places, and they tend to be relatively small, like in Norway or Luxembourg, that actually are richer per person than we are. And but on the other hand, we have a lot of what I would call social poverty. We have people who are alone, people who are depressed, anxious, feel alienated, feel like they're cut off from opportunity. So we're a huge country. We're vast. We're very diverse. And I think one of the most obvious things, which is why my book is called Fragile Neighborhoods, is that how you're feeling America, how you're experiencing America depends so much upon where you are. And just to give you an example, lifespan is a crude barometer indicator of how well people are doing. And it's not perfect, but in the United States, we have our overall lifespan average has been stagnant or somewhat declining, and certainly has been diverging from other developed countries for 40 years. So there's a lot of countries like a Portugal, which is much poorer than the United States, but they have much better health outcomes. So that's the total. So you have to ask why is that? But more specifically, how well you're doing it in terms of lifespan depends upon where you live. There's an incredible 40-year gap in lifespan. And I just asked you, I don't know your area very well, but if you're in a Baltimore, or if you're in a Detroit, or if you're in different parts of the country, you can easily just walk around and see there's a neighborhood in which things seem nice, place is secure, institutions are strong, families are strong. And then you go to another neighborhood and you have none of the above. People are a lot more instability, a lot less economic opportunity. And in reality, they're experiencing life differently. Even if they're materially well off, they may be very isolated. There may be no social connection. So this is why neighborhood matters. So we have a 40-year gap based upon where you live. And I would say a more typical gap is 20. And that number alone is telling us a lot about how well places are doing, and where we are matters so much for how we're experiencing the country.
Yeah, that's actually really important, because I think there's a lot of folks listening who know about that experience where within a span of 5 minutes, maybe even a couple miles, separates a community that's doing well versus a community that's struggling. And in those 5-10 miles, as you said, there are people that are living 20, 30, 40 years longer. And some of that definitely has to do with resources, and really a lot of this has to do with some of the food that we eat. You had mentioned, just in general, Americans' lifespan is declining versus some other European countries. I would imagine some of that has to do with the amount of processed food, which is a completely separate subject, but kind of also ties into this conversation because at a neighborhood level, even if you think about the grocery stores that are available in one community versus another, that tells you a lot about the resources that are being allocated there as well. So there's so much to think about in terms of the layers, and it is something that most of us listening have visually seen ourselves. So to your point, one of the comments was around how the US is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But with so much of society seemingly crumbling, I mean, and the fact that you've gone to more than 70 countries, what's your take on how we look in the eyes of other countries?
I mean, again, it's like this two different dimensions. People want to come here because we have the rule of law. Our institutions like that work for the most part very well. There are imperfections, there are inequalities in how that works, but compared to like in Nigeria where I go to somewhat regularly, you have to worry when you take a highway between cities, am I going to be kidnapped? You don't go in the nighttime, you go at certain times of day, some roads you avoid, trains have been attacked. And I mean, there's low-level violence in many parts of the country. It's completely different if you're coming from one of these countries, and there's dozens of countries that are unstable, economically stagnant. I mean, even gang violence, like in Central America, drug cartels in Mexico. We look pretty good. There's more jobs. There's, for the most part, more stability, and everybody assumes they're going to wind up in the better places. They may be shocked by our problems, but they mostly assume those problems aren't going to happen to me. I'm going to get to this country and I'm going to do well. And I think the immigrant experience is very diverse. And I mean, you could be, if you come, we talk about social poverty. Social poverty is different than material poverty. If you're in a strong immigrant community, you can have very rich relationships, very strong support structures, and everyone is helping everyone lift themselves up and do better. And if you're like in that situation, you're somewhat protected. If you go to the right part of America, you come with enough education and some resources. I think you can avoid these problems. But at the same time, people look at America and they see our political fights, they see our gun violence, they see. I don't think the drug overdoses are so advertised. For me, they're just one of the most shocking things about the country. So many people dying. It doesn't make the newspapers, but It's just shocking to see the scale of the problem. And we could go through all these problems, things like depression and loneliness. People don't imagine that's going to happen to them. I would just say it's a trade-off. People want a certain amount of rule of law and stability and economic opportunity. And they never assume that they're going to be one of the lonely ones, isolated ones, one of the possible, might end up in one of these worse neighborhoods. And so they think it's not going to happen to them. So they can look down on America and still want to go there at the same time. So I think it's a complicated picture for people. And I'd say the movies and everything, I mean, they just make people, they entice people. And enough and whatever the news and everything. Yes, it's very enticing, and people don't look at the downside.
Yeah, I can understand that. And it's somewhat sad if you think about it, because there's something to be said about the fact that our prosperity as a nation, and maybe I'll use prosperity with quotes around it.
Material prosperity.
Yeah, as a nation has done very little in terms of actually helping our overall well-being. And I think that there's something to be said about that.
I mean, again, everything is so relative in our country. I argue that the big change in America in the last two generations is we basically went from a country where place mattered and every place had institutions that supported us to basically a society based on networks. And if you're in the right network, you get help to make sure you get into the right college, You get a better network in college. You get into some network after college. If you're on that track, you get into the right organization. I mean, you're doing well. And so there's a class of people, and there's a way to get into that class if you can have enough of a network and pass the right test, so to speak. The problem is, what about a lot of other people? A lot of other people, they're in places where there's none of those networks that can help them. They may have networks, and networks are not helpful. Their networks may be negative. They may be giving the wrong lessons, or constraining you in different ways. And so I think we have great inequality, but the greatest inequality is not material. It's our social relationships, or social capital, or social networks. And I think some of us, especially if you live in some of the worst places, what I call fragile, or you might call distressed, especially if you have material and social poverty together. You're like, if you're a youth or a kid, you're growing up with like a weight on your shoulder, and you could climb out of there, but you're being held back by a lot of what you're experiencing every day. And we have to consider, I mean, if we want to ensure a country opportunity for everybody, I do believe the only way to do that is to ensure everyone lives in a flourishing neighborhood. And that's a pretty good equal starting point for everybody.
Yeah, and that reminds me that this is a classic phrase that's not what you know, it's who you know, and that can take you places. But to your point, when so many people feel like they're out of the loop, I mean, you got to start asking yourself, like, how many of us are actually a part of a real community? How many of us are actually part of an ecosystem where everyone feels like they're committed to the cause? How many of us are part of a community where, the progress is being made? How many of us truly feel supported and can feel comfortable asking for help, or asking for like a sense of belonging? I mean, these are questions that are pretty deep, but I think they hit on what a lot of people might be feeling, because they feel out of place, out of the loop, just simply on where they are, literally physically located. And your comments also remind me of a piece of your book where you really highlight a couple of examples. And this is for anyone who wants to buy the book, they can look this up. But basically, if you look at history, a lot of us are taught about certain individual acts or certain individual people in different parts of our history. But the reality is, behind the scenes, there's a very high chance that there was collaboration, there were groups, there were organizations that were helping that one individual. And so kind of a reminder that, we live in an era where, that individual act gets the headline, but behind the scenes, there's a network, there's a group, there's collaboration that's taking place. And that's the type of stuff that's required to maybe fix some of these fragile neighborhoods and areas moving forward.
I mean, I'm a big believer in the market. I'm a big believer in competition, capitalism, but I also know that people who have come from strong families, strong neighborhoods, strong social networks, are more likely to thrive, more likely to succeed. I mean, you can see it in the data. I talked about the life differences. You can talk about social mobility. You could talk about the health of people and their access to jobs. You can just look at a lot of things. But I also can speak. I mean, I can speak from personal experience. I live in a very flourishing neighborhood with lots of relationships. I may not be friends with a lot of people, but I know hundreds of people in my neighborhood. Well, first thing is, you walk down the street and you have this sense of joy. You have the sense that you feel there's a security blanket there. If I have a need for something, I know I can knock on a door, or I know where to go. I mean, I can speak. I have a son, and his older sister dropped him once right in front of my house coming out of the car. He was probably about 2 years old. His chin fell on the cement. I want you to think about that, bleeding. Ooh. Parents are both there. My wife and I totally like, what do we do? And my wife's immediate reaction, she's a bit faster than I in an emergency, picked him up and took off down the street. And I'm like, where did she go? And what's wrong with my son? And what do we do? She went to the closest nurse, and she knew the closest nurse was a couple blocks away. And it turns out, because we just know a lot of people, we probably know 5, 6, 7, 8 nurses. within, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes walking of where I am right now. And so I ask people, if you had that emergency, or I'm thinking this past week, my mother-in-law was coming out of the hospital, wasn't well. My wife took off to take care of her mother-in-law, and I needed help getting my kids back and forth to school because I had plans and I had another podcast or I had a meeting or something like that. And immediately I had 4 different neighbors in the 2 mornings, 2 afternoons, taking care of my kids, picking them up, taking them after school. And my life was so much easier. And an app can't solve these problems. And I would say that we're taught not only to be very individualistic, especially for those who are materially well off. We're taught to not show our vulnerabilities to people. We're taught that we should be self-reliant. We're taught to never do anything that make us look bad. And I would say that's bad advice. And that's like a norm. And we almost are teaching our kids, don't take risks, don't do things that make you look bad. Let's try to be overprotective of our kids, overprotective of ourselves. And I understand why people want to look good, but it really helps to have relationships, I mean, my whole life is very individualistic, the types of choices I made, yet I live in a place where we have a sense of interdependency. We help each other. Somebody needs something, I get involved. I'm on the board of some local nonprofit. I'm involved with another association. And the key thing is people just have a norm, a regular habit that we're here to be pleasant to each other. We're here to be helpful. We're here to, if people are worried about, I'll just give you one more example. I'm on the WhatsApp group, several WhatsApp groups from my neighborhood, and some kid about 22, 23 had not come home for 24 hours. And boom, people said, let's form a search party. This happened on Monday. I was in Denver on Monday, and I'm watching my phone, and I says, I'm going to join this WhatsApp group. I'm going to see what's going on. So they said, we're meeting at 4 p.m. A bunch of people got onto the WhatsApp group, whatever. I don't know how many, 15, 20 people. They went around all organizing by this WhatsApp group. In an hour, they had some idea. People were saying he's probably on one of these paths in the woods near where we live. Everybody spread out. And they found them like in an hour and a half. And then they're organizing, well, who needs a pickup? How do you get home? And there it is. It's like neighborhood mobilization on very short notice to solve a problem. And that's like a very simple example of what happens when you live in a community of care and interdependence. And I just think people's lives are better. And it's best not to think we're alone and not to think we need to do everything ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very powerful example, and it's the complete opposite of the feeling that someone in a fragile neighborhood has, where there is stress, there is, mistrust, there's some frustration, and that sense of security that you felt or feel, that's lacking in the fragile neighborhoods. And so it's a complete opposite picture of what a lot of folks are living with. And it really makes you think about, like, okay, if you're in a fragile neighborhood and there's so much stress and frustration and mistrust, like, how healthy is that for anyone? That's also another topic. But if you look at certain minority groups, they are, let's say, 10 times more likely to be living in poor neighborhoods, and they've been living in poor neighborhoods for multiple generations. And it's really hard to get out of high poverty neighborhoods. You kind of talked about it earlier, like some people can, but the reality is that there's a lot on people's shoulders for them to actually lift up and get out, in terms of getting out of a social or economic, poverty lifestyle. And that's, I'd be curious, like, why do you think the government is ignoring so many of our neighborhoods? How can there be something passed where $100 billion goes to our own cities? Can that just come out of a defense budget? Like, I'm curious, how can a leader step up? What approach can actually be considered right now? Because these are high stakes situations. Fixing American societies is a high stakes situation, and the anger and the bitterness that might be boiling up right now in those communities, who's to say when that explodes? There's a lot going on, so I'd be curious your thoughts on all that.
Yeah. I'll give a few comments on that. So first, I'm not sure the trade-off is between our defense and our domestic, because it is a dangerous world. So we should always keep in mind that the world is getting increasingly dangerous, and so I think the trade-off is whether we address problems one by one or we address problems place by place. I've worked in a lot of countries, and there has been hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign aid given to these countries, and there's successes and there's failures. And I think it's the same in the United States. The successes have been programs that are run at the individual level. Healthcare, the healthcare of people in Africa, for example, aid has done an incredible job improving the health of people, vaccinations, dealing with AIDS, other health issues. It is something that aid does very well, helping individuals. On the other hand, aid to help governments work better or countries work better, not a lot of track record. Some countries do better. That's because they themselves do better, not because of aid. So when government acts, government generally it thinks better in individualistic terms. It thinks not so well in place-based terms. And I would argue that there's some things we could do for government to be more successful dealing with places. Right now, think about how government is structured and how we would spend that money you talk about. We would put it into the housing department. We would put it into the healthcare. We would put it into schools. But what happens if the problem is not any one of these? The problem is something with the social dynamics of a place. And that this is not an easy problem for the government to fix, but there are some things government could do. First of all, government could be structured not around departments. It could be structured around places, around neighborhoods, with neighborhood-based teams that would be basically evaluated on how good places did, instead of evaluated on how many housing units were built or how many school seats were filled or how many permits were issued. Right now, government is basically about numbers, units, silos, and increasing. And I argue that that's the wrong way to measure the success of government, and government should be structured differently. That would be one thing. A second thing is government could instead think of our landscape. Right now, it zones, it plans, it structures our landscape so that we all live in houses, and it tries to make nice roads and tries to encourage nice houses, and it doesn't create like good places. What would happen if our physical landscape was designed around neighborhoods, and each of those neighborhoods had places to meet, had local institutions, had community schools? So there are things that government could do to structure our landscape, and then structure its own institutions, and structure the way it spent money, and structure the way it was organized, such that its main goal was to promote flourishing neighborhoods, instead of more of this unit, more of that unit, and thinking in a really big scope with what we might call as vertical indicators. One, basically looking at single numbers to measure what we're doing. How about looking at a lot of place numbers and adding them up and focused on the how flourishing each place is? So I think government is extremely important for the challenge we have about neighborhoods. But I think government, as it currently functions, will have a very hard time doing a good job improving places.
Yeah, because basically they should transform to create stronger social systems.
It should be designed to encourage social systems. Yes, I mean, obviously, I don't want to say homelessness isn't a problem. I don't want to say hunger isn't a problem. For sure, these are problems, and they are short-term problems that need to be addressed. But if we don't go upstream and strengthen this great social support system that we live in, or that we should live in, or that all of human history was built around these local place-based communities. I mean, this is the organic way people develop societies throughout human history. Wasn't always perfect. Maybe there was too much conformity, marginalized some people. There might have been discrimination. It wasn't perfect, but what it did do was provide social structure, social system, a lot of social institutions, businesses, schools, associations, places to worship, lots of things going on locally, and we all we knew each other and we were in this together, and that's been lost. And I don't think we can deal with these many social problems and all the anxiety and all the depression and all the drug problems and what have you if everyone is living in some social system that is thriving and helping them thrive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And to tie into that comment you just made, I mean, according to one study in your book, the portion of Americans that are reporting that they have quote unquote no close friends has quadrupled since 1990. So it goes back to the point of how people feel like they're less of a society, less of a community, less of a network. And then add to that, about 25% of Americans aged 18 years or older are now medicated for depression or
I
anxiety.
mean,
And
the
so,
numbers are incredible. The numbers are incredible.
yeah. And so suicide rates are going up. People are depressed. People are, have anxiety. People are on medication. And so there's this disconnect from society. And there might be a disconnect based on the fact that, people living in communities have been told that there's going to be change, and change tends to take a long time. And so I'd be curious what you would say to the people who are in communities who are done trying to transform their community because just change is taking too long. And some of the changes you proposed, I mean, if that goes into effect, I mean, you're probably looking at another 20 years, right, before that really gets implemented. So what would you say to the people who might be really disconnected from trying to transform their own community at this point?
I mean, I think, again, people don't want things done to them, to the extent that, I mean, think about how life used to be. However, people are much less wealthy, but they belong to some local networks, some local associations. They might have been informal, they might not have been formal. But if you look at de Tocqueville's view of America almost 200 years ago, there was all this abundance of local institutions, associations. And we had something like that, not the same form as de Tocqueville saw, up until the 60s. And so people are a member of something, and they have a chance that they feel a sense of agency or ownership.
Yeah.
They have a stake in their place, and they feel that they can do something. And what we do now is those institutions, associations have thinned or disappeared. Some places still have them, but these are more exceptions than the rule. And it's not just about someone from outside coming in and saying, we're going to lift you up. That's doing to people. We need to nurture. This is why the social dynamics matter so much. Not only is it about lifting people up, it's about giving them agency, empowering them. And empowerment is not an individual thing. Yes, it's about individuals doing things. You're empowered because you're in a network. You're empowered because you have these social ties, these institutions you can leverage. Sometimes you create your own. But even an individual one, there's a network behind it. There's partners behind it. And to the extent that we have lots of those things going on and a lot of people able to do something, people's perception of change is different. People will shape the change. People will participate in the change. People will volunteer for the change. And I mean, that's the kind of pathway we need to think about. We just can't say government or philanthropy or some nonprofit's going to come in and give you something and then somehow you'll be better. I don't think that's not change. I mean, obviously, if I need a place to live, I might need someone to give me something. But if you really want to change a neighborhood, part of it is finding those leaders, encouraging the emergence of leaders, encouraging, catalyzing the emergence of action, cooperation, institutions. You want to catalyze the emergence, some sort of organic emergence of things. And there's ways to do that. And if I'm an individual in the neighborhood, I don't want to wait. I want to say, can I find 2 or 3 people around here that I can do something? Or do I want to look for a local organization I can volunteer for? Or I'm thinking of my neighbor down the street from me. She goes every week and knocks on the door of people who live alone. And her mother lives in the neighborhood and she's alone. That might be the starting point for her. I don't know what started her, but I see her walking up and down the street, just banging on doors. She knows who's alone. How many houses? How frequently? I can't tell you. But I see her in front of my house walking along the streets. And so there's things that we can do. There's things that we can team up with people to do. We can find other associations. So we don't want to wait, but when things are going to be done, the best thing is that people, some sort of activity, some sort of change emerges from a place, might be catalyzed from outside, but we want it to emerge and be led in some form by what is going on. It might be a partnership. You might add outside resources, outside capacity, outside leadership, but you want the local people to be engaged and not having things be done to them. Too many things in our country are being done to people and places. And that's, I think, one reason why there's so much alienation and anger.
No, I love that. That's really deep and thorough, and it highlights a portion of your book where you talk about building trust by building together. And if you're going to
Yes.
show up in a community, instead of asking people to trust you, now you should really start asking people to hold you accountable. So if you're a community leader, you want to build from within, you want to build together, ask them to hold you accountable, right? So the way you're going to hold yourself accountable is if you show up over and over and over again, if you actually take the time to hear what the residents are saying, if you actually, as you mentioned, maybe start identifying 2 or 3 people in the community that can be serving as gatekeepers to get you in front of more people. And that's how you build more trust within the fellow residents that live in that particular community. And so it really starts very small. It really starts, very, locally. And then from there can really grow, as opposed to saying, we're an organization, we're going to come in here and just trust what we do. But unless you're identifying local leaders, unless you're supporting local businesses, unless you're really in the community, unless you're trying to even showcase the culture of the community, really, you're probably just going to fall on deaf ears.
I mean, you're referring to an example I give. Chris Lambert in Detroit and his organization Life Remodeled. I mean, I was very fortunate to find these 5 great organizations. So he's in Detroit. He's doing great work. He's beautifying neighborhoods. He's cleaning up streets. He's helping people repair houses, roofs, boilers. And if you know Detroit, I mean, if you haven't been to Detroit, it's worth just going to Detroit and driving around. What a landscape. It's like a post-conflict landscape. Some neighborhoods have disappeared. Some neighborhoods, houses are crumbling. The population is down 65% from its peak. And that means that large chunks of what was Detroit is no longer there. And it's just something to say. So he's in a neighborhood and he was given an opportunity to take over the most important building in the neighborhood, a middle school, because the student population shrunk and a lot of schools have fallen into disrepair. The city basically said, the education authorities said, here, you take over this building. You have a good plan, a plan to build a neighborhood hub, and this will be great for this neighborhood. Well, he discovered that beautifying streets and repairing houses, people love that. He was coming, doing something for them and leaving. But here he was going to set up shop. He had a 50-year agreement and he was going to be their neighbor. And moreover, he's a white guy and this is a black neighborhood. And is he going to come and push us out? Or is other white people going to come and push us out? And a lot of anger resulted. He couldn't imagine. He thought he was just doing a good thing. He was going to bring organizations, create a hub, create opportunity, bring in healthcare, after-school clubs, loads of things for people. And there was just unhappiness with him. And he had to take a step back and learn some painful lessons. And what emerged from this is he had to learn what it meant to build a relationship, not just a thin relationship where he's giving things to people, but a thick relationship where we're partnering. And again, we're not going to solve our divisions and our polarization by just sitting around and talking. And what he's learned over and over again through volunteers, through this work, and through other things is people build trust by doing things for each other, by doing things with each other, for each other, and showing up over and over again and being judged by performance. So what he had to do to build trust is that he had to literally go street by street, break bread with people, develop more personal relationships, not hold big meetings. Big meetings are easy to get people to be angry, to talk in front of their neighbors about how angry they are, and might also attract people from elsewhere. So he went around, he broke bread, he sat down, had meals with people, Then he identified people who are like the leaders in different parts of the neighborhood. Different areas have different leaders. Built their trust, listened to them, incorporated their ideas. Eventually, he formed 2 advisory councils that he holds himself accountable to. One is these local leaders, and one is students, because a lot of what he does is for students, and he wants students' input. And then he actually had to change what his organization was made up of who was staffing this organization and this hub. And instead of what he had, he basically was started to recruit people from the neighborhood or neighboring neighborhoods, so that in the end was he had an institution, and institutions are hugely important for promoting change. His institution was very locally based in terms of its people, in terms of who it was accountable to, in terms of how it designed its programming, and even its name was given by something called Durfee Innovation Center is the name they gave to this hub, and that is the name that the students gave to him. So
Nice.
basically, he basically became a part of the neighborhood in this gradual process of change, and then people trust him much more readily. And it's a great lesson that we don't have trust in America. Part of it is we're not practicing working with other people anymore. We're more likely to be distant from our institutions, distant from our neighbors. Trust is something you learn by actually being in relationships, being in institutions, working with each other. And if you're going to a neighborhood to try to do something, you got to learn what it means to build that trust and those relationships, and find ways for people to really believe in what you do. And then you got to prove yourself over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a powerful example. Chris is doing great work. And one of the keys there is, the way you approach a community needs to be tailored to that community, as opposed to thinking that, for example, Chris, right? He's having success now in Detroit after a couple of lessons. It'd probably be a mistake for Chris to think that he can just pick up and take that same mindset in terms of like what worked there to, a different part of the country that's struggling. I guess the mindset would be that it needs to be tailored to that area. So, social repair in Detroit is very different than social repair in West Virginia, for example, where, the problems there are different. They're mostly
So different,
around
so
painkillers.
different. This is
So,
this is a vast country, rural versus urban. I mean, we haven't talked about like Native American reservations, or the
right.
South versus the Midwest, San Diego versus Detroit. What a diverse country we live in.
Yeah. Something that you had mentioned earlier was your children, and I'm also a dad now too, and so family is really important.
How old are your children?
One kid, he's 19 months old.
Wow. I mean, what do you see every day? That child needs unconditional love. Testing you always. And the moment there's not love and stability there, that kid feels it. I'm just telling you. That's the key to relationships right there.
Yeah. He's also taught me a lot too, in terms of letting go, and watching him, you just see just the most natural behaviors. At this point, he hasn't been institutionalized. He doesn't have real, like, other people's thoughts in his head. He's just going off of feeling and vibe, and just going off of what makes him happy. And so I just look at that sometimes, and I'm like, that's a lesson for adults too, of just like, let go of, whatever preconceived thoughts you have. I think the word should be eliminated. Sometimes I caught myself, saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And then like 5 seconds later, I'm like, wait, we need to eliminate the word should. Should is creating so much pressure. Because at the end of the day, like, let this soul blossom. So anyway, we could talk about family, from that perspective, another time.
The one exception I would say is you should not touch the knife or something like that for that age. Please, the safety part, I would have boundaries. That's the one thing that scares me the most every day.
True.
But otherwise, true. I encourage, we over protect our kids. And if you're thinking of your child is learning to walk, learning to talk, and making a lot of mistakes along the way. Yeah. And when they get a little older, my oldest is 11, and that's still not so old. And when they get older, you need them to get out there onto the neighborhood. And if you feel confident in your neighborhood, you're going to be confident in letting your kids get out there, and hopefully they have friends, and hopefully they're going to wander a little bit. And they need to learn to take care of themselves. They need to learn to make mistakes. And it's really important to like let them grow in that sense. And if you're friends with neighbors, you'll have more confidence for that. I mean, growing up is step by step learning, and we don't want to be overprotective. But if you know your neighborhood well, it really helps you let your kids grow organically, I will tell you.
Yeah. And again, I think it's a privilege and a luxury to be able to live in that type of scenario where it does feel like, you're overprotective, and they have that kind of community where they can go out and, learn to make some mistakes, but not ones that are too drastic. Because on the other hand, there are so many situations where the next generation is neglected. When you think about how families are being torn apart, whether it's just, divorce, whether it's drugs, whether it's, violence, poverty, all the different struggles that you can think about. So families are kind of being torn apart. I think that as a result of that, there's a lot of pressure in the school system, where pressure is put on teachers to also be parents, which I think is unfair. And so I really think that, we need to have a better way of supporting our children and supporting the students. And because it feels like the next generation might be like lost right now.
I feel a lot of people are lost, and I think part of it is they're not in institutions, and they're not like learning. I mean, when you're a part of something, you have the sense of agency. You have the sense that you can contribute, you can do things. I mean, you're learning to compromise, you're learning to cooperate, you're learning to trust, you're learning. I mean, we all need to make mistakes in relationships. There's this whole thing in America about people are afraid to date, it seems to me. I mean, it's a bit shocking. And when I grew up, I mean, the people, if anything, could have dated less. There was like everything. It was nonstop. Everything in terms of, it was like the teenage life that and the young life that we see in the movies. But you see things. I just think people are risk averse, and part of it is they're not being socialized to spend time with each other. And it's so important that we learn to spend time with each other. And again, neighborhoods make that possible. And we want to be in person with people. You talked before about the reduction in friends. I mean, our neighbors are not always our friends, but our neighbors are, again, relationships. And we often have organizations or informal things we do with each other, and there's a give and take. Someone comes over and they need flour. I mean, that happens in my neighborhood. It's not just a movie. Or we have some need, and we need butter or whatever it is that my wife wants, and we're going asking across the street. And I mean, this is part of practicing relationships. The more we practice it just day in and day out, I think the stronger we will be. And then the more things we do with relationships, from dating to family to building organizations that help our place. I mean, all of this, I mean, I think it's healthy for us. It's healthy for our neighbors. It's healthy for our society. I mean, otherwise we're just on the technology and we're just angry about politics. And that's not great. I mean, that's not great. Why should we be so depressed about everything? We should look for ways that we can make a real contribution where we are.
Yeah, that's why I'm putting the onus back on parents. Because, there are studies that show that kids who are raised in a household with both parents, they're going to be better off from an education perspective, an income perspective, a social mobility perspective, even if it's one parent. But if kids are left without their biological parents, then obviously, they're probably going to be more inclined to commit crime or have behavioral issues, maybe emotional issues. And what's concerning to me personally is that because I have a son, is that it's the boys that typically start to act out in society. They're the ones who are antisocial in terms of being aggressive, in terms of being disruptive, in terms of becoming bullies and showing defiance. And so like the absence of a stable father or a stable mother and father figure. Like you lose role models, and it's really impacting the next generation. And there could be adverse consequences that we would all have to deal with in society. So it's not just like the family dealing with it, it's like everyone deals with it, because families are broken right now.
For sure. I mean, every situation is different. I mean, my parents got divorced, and they might have had a very good reason for being divorced. So every situation is different, and if someone is abusive or someone is just not the right fit, there are many situations where things could be better. But of course, I would say the data is very clear that on average, people are happier if they're married. The data is very clear that children have much better outcomes if their parents stay together and if their father is there on a regular day in, day out basis. The data is even very clear that that's good for adults. And this information is especially true for boys and men. Boys do much worse when the family situation is unstable, and men do worse when they're not in a marriage and a close relationship. And it doesn't always have to be marriage, but it has to be that strong relationship, permanent relationship that operates like a marriage, even if you've never had that piece of paper signed. And the thing that's not good for kids, particularly, is family instability. And I mean, I write about it that I mean, there are cases where it might be better, but in general, single parent households, there's less time for the kids. There's less discipline for the kids. There's less money for the kids. There's a lot of things that are different, and kids are worse off. And I mean, even inequality. We think of inequality in our society. Inequality is tremendously related to family situations. So I would. I mean, again, every situation is different, but to the extent that people are in relationships and there are children, I would urge people to double up in terms of their commitment to their family, to their kids. And if you get married and you stay married and you are the parent your kids need every day, I think longer term you will be better off and your kids will be better off. And I looked at one organization in particular, a Communio, that's all they did. They tried to encourage people to be married to ensure that kids turned out well. And I looked at another organization that was basically looking at situations where there wasn't a stable family and kids were doing very bad at school, the worst kids in Baltimore, bottom 25%. And then they sought to create a family-like structure around those kids. And the key thing was unconditional love, 10 years, 24/7, 3 a.m. in the morning, you need help. There's a security problem on your street. You don't have food. You need help with homework. You need help finding with your application to college. And they are transformative in that results for the kids, because those kids, everyone needs unconditional love. And unconditional love is not only something we give them, but strong institutions, strong family, strong marriage family. And then if not, there are some sort of strong, this is volunteers, like some sort of interfamily network that supports the kids. I mean, without that, kids are not going to thrive. And a lot of our problems are only going to get worse. And that's so essential.
Yeah. And that's an interesting perspective shift, because you mentioned the bottom 25% of that, the kids in that neighborhood are getting that 24/7 support. Whereas in a lot of situations, people tend to pick on the top 25% and
yes, exactly,
watching them excel. It's like, actually go with the bottom 25%. And that's even more grassroots in terms of, you develop them. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, there's an ROI to this investment to the poorer communities and that bottom 25%. There's trillions of dollars of economic activity that is untapped. And if we pay attention and actually put our investment there, it could be good for society. Combine that with the fact that maybe, in terms of a solution for people who feel lost right now and who, maybe feeling like they don't have that sense of like a healthy relationship around them, is we see a decline in the people who are religious and going to places of worship. And so maybe reconsidering that is another shift in perspective. Because at the end of the day, like if you're looking for stronger relationships, if you're looking for stronger role models, and if you're looking for a sense of belonging in a community, those place of worship tends to be that.
So I'll say, I think there's two different directions you're taking us here. So first, when people try to help those in these poor communities, besides giving them things, they basically look for some top achievers and they tend to extract them. They take them to help them get into some better school, better job, and they extract them. And they very rarely think about making the neighborhoods better. And they never think of the consequences of taking the best, possibly the best leaders, the best investors, the best models out of those neighborhoods. So one reason why we have a lot of distressed neighborhoods or distressed areas in America is much of the best talent year in, year out are being removed. And I don't want to deny people their future, but every place needs a talent retention strategy. And it also needs a way to make those neighborhoods attractive so people want to live there. That's why mixed income housing is really important. Let's not put all the low income housing in the poor neighborhoods. It makes them less and less attractive and drives the best people out. On the other hand, if you're trying to help society, you should always think what's the best ROI. So I had two different organizations that took like strategies for helping kids. One of them took the bottom 25%, which was the Baltimore. Another one working in Kentucky took the second 25%, the 26 to 50%. They thought that 25% would have the biggest impact on the whole 100% because they were impacting the group below and the group above. And so they thought that was the best ROI. So I can't say there's one answer here. Thread in Baltimore, Sarah Heminger, she took the worst 25% and basically does miracles to uplift them. And I'm sure that has some impact on the schools and the neighborhoods. And you want cascading effect, you want spin-offs to what you're doing. So again, that matters. And again, and as for your latter point, I mean, institutions are everything. It's hard to build community without institutions. You can certainly build community without religion. I'm thinking Chevy Chase, not far from me. I'm thinking of Park Slope in Brooklyn. I'm thinking of places that have a lot of institutions, a lot of social activity, and are not known for being religious at all. So it's possible. But for most of us, probably the easiest place to find community is find a house of worship where there is some level of community. And I don't think all churches and synagogues and mosques actually build community today. So you have to be careful. I mean, one of my messages to religious leaders are stop being a consumer product. Stop. I mean, too many houses of worship. They're just a few hours on Sunday morning, and there may be some functional networks around different needs in your life. And they're like everything else in America. They're a consumer product. And I wish houses of worship would be community builders, place-based community builders, and even countercultural, where they went back to what religion was. Religion used to be some thick concept where people had close relationships with each other. And today that's less and less the case. And I think religious leaders should put the focus on community building. Let's not get involved. Let's not mix religion and politics, for example. Let's focus on strengthening relationships, strengthening family, strengthening interfamily dynamics, bringing people in who are single and maybe lonely, thinking about how we make places and neighborhoods better. And each of us, if we're searching for that, that might be a place to go. Again, it's not for everybody. Right. Everyone is different. And I'm not here to give, there's no shoulds, I think you said. There's no shoulds, but there's your option, right? One option, and you have a menu of options. And you could volunteer for a nonprofit. You could be in a board of a nonprofit, and that could be a way to get yourself involved deeply with something. So there's a lot of things we can do, but that's one option.
Yeah, I love that. The word options. And, you mentioned talent retention strategy. The reason that's important is because, for the people that are able to leave, they tend to do that, which ultimately leaves that fragile neighborhood with fewer working people, fewer role models, fewer mentors. And so having a talent retention strategy is one thing to consider. And to your point, there could be someone listening to this right now who feels inspired and empowered to become more of a community leader, or as you write in your book, become the community quarterback, right? You have a chance here to step up as a leader. You have a chance here to take on a vision. You have a chance to safeguard the interests of the residents in the community. You have the chance to really promote the community culture. You have a chance to look for representation on different boards, different committees. You can start working with different authorities, whether they are, the housing authority, whether they're real estate developers, whether they're in healthcare, whether they're, focused on philanthropy. I mean, the reality is that there is a challenge here that, if you can create a well-planned, well-resourced, and well-run community as a quarterback, you have a chance to really uplift a lot of people, drive economic activity, drive higher social mobility and psychological mobility. It's a game changer across the board in terms of the overall well-being. So if somebody's listening and they feel empowered to become a community quarterback, I think there's a lot to be said there. And you have a chance right now in a number of communities and neighborhoods to really start making some sort of dent, especially if you do it at a very local level and if you start small.
So I would say every individual can contribute and do something. And I mentioned alone, with a few neighbors, joining or starting some association. So there's different levels. I would say a neighborhood quarterback is an example I use. Started with East Lake Foundation in Atlanta. I mean, that's another even level up. So you have to have some resources. You need to develop some partnerships. It could be that you look at a series of associations, if you have the capacity in your neighborhood, and you bring them together and they combine to put together a neighborhood quarterback or some sort of neighborhood platform. There's many ways to do this, but the neighborhood quarterback, if it had the resources, the management capacity, and the network, could work with different parts of the government, could work with philanthropy, could work with different nonprofits, and could develop a more strategic plan, a bigger picture strategic plan for a neighborhood, and then brought all these people to the table where they would work together to develop the plan. I mean, you would want input from other people in the neighborhood and other leaders in the neighborhood. I mean, that's the most ambitious of I'm giving you different options. That's the most ambitious because it really involves strategic thinking, lots of meetings, and bringing in partners, and eventually getting resources and doing much bigger things than one institution normally could do or a set of volunteers could do. But it's depends what your ambitions are, depends what you think is possible. And some people have done that, and there's results to show for that.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely a roll up the sleeves, 100% commitment type of role. But it's the options available. So Seth, as we wrap up here, definitely want to say thank you for your time, but maybe we can close with how you think about ways to encourage people in terms of how they're thinking about the American dream. I mean, how would you encourage people to rethink what the American dream is based on the conversation we just had, plus your own work and research and your own living experience?
First, I would say the American dream should not be defined just by material, more money, bigger house, better career. I mean, we all are ambitious. So I would say be ambitious, but I would encourage people to think of the dream as a rich social life, a role for family, a role for commitment to community, to society, a leadership role in your local, it could be neighborhood or local area. It doesn't always have to be neighborhood. If you're in a rural area, it could be at the county level. If you're in a city, it could be someplace beyond your neighborhood. But I would say leadership today is not sending a check to a far-off charity. Leadership today is not, I think politics matter, but it's not screaming for something to do with national politics or national policy. That's not, or not are not having as your ambition to go far away and do something nationally or globally. Those are wonderful things, and maybe that's good for some people. But real leadership today is rolling up your sleeves and finding ways to contribute to real people in a real place, trying to solve real problems. And that place is close to home. Those people are close to home. Those problems are real problems. They're not abstract problems. They're not things we can do virtually. There might be a virtual component, a supplement. We want to look, it could be our neighborhood. Again, it could be nearby. And there's many ways to do what I'm describing. But I would say, think of citizenship, think of patriotism, think of social engagement in the local. And there's many ways to do this locally, but you're going to have a much bigger impact. You're going to have much better relationships. You're going to be dealing with practical problems, not things that divide, but things that unite. You'll have more friendships. You'll see real results. You will be happier. That's what real leadership is. And I encourage everyone who is watching or listening to find ways to do that. I think your life will be better. Your neighbors, your neighborhood, your cities, our society, our country will be better.
That's amazing. I feel fortunate for this conversation. Yeah, you clearly helped us explore some of the tough questions that a lot of people in neighborhoods face today. You helped us learn about how arranging a community is really how we arrange an entire society. We highlighted how, two cities right next to each other can be so different. We talked about how averse people are to joining groups. We talked about the different social conditions that can be improved, the different physical conditions that can be improved. You shared so many ideas, initiatives, options that we call them options, that social repairers can work on and develop. And I think the biggest takeaway here is feeling empowered that we have the power within us and the resources within us to turn neighborhoods around and communities around, and taking some of the earlier words you said, turn them into thriving and flourishing places. So I really want to say thank you for your time, and I feel fortunate for this opportunity.
I'm thrilled that we could have this conversation, and I thank you for being so prepared and knowing the topic so well. So it's great. And just for anyone who's listening, if I can be helpful, feel free to reach out. Find me on my website, sethkaplan.org. Find me by email. Find me on LinkedIn. I only want to help people find ways to help strengthen their neighborhood.
Beautiful. And the book is called Fragile Neighborhoods: Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. Thanks, Seth.
My pleasure. Thank you.